Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and if you know me, then you know I love me some robot-based shenanigans, which means a game about little anthropomorphic robots repossessing monster house belongings is right up my alley. So without further ado, let's make ourselves some teeny tiny tubular Repo Bots, or botlings, or semi-bots, or whatever the hell they're called. Now the first step in making a robot is, of course, taking a rectangular block of clay and turning it into a nice firm tube by rolling it aggressively back and forth until you've got a heavy gray sausage, at which point you can cut it into a couple smaller sausage-shaped shapes which can then get baked in the oven. Now that these tubes are hard, I'll roll the remainder of my clay log back into the fray so I can cut some smaller domes off the top to make a few heads. A little light smooshing will shape my head into a head-shaped shape, and I can toss it into the oven while I get to work adding some detail to the torso. I'll wrap the Repo torso in a thick band of clay, cutting away the excess and rounding the tips before baking it so I can add a bit more of the same on top of that to give it a 3-tiered robot cake finish, at which point my head is hot out the oven and I can double check everything lines up well enough. Now, content with my content, I can bring these bad boys over to my sandpaper and start smoothing out any of the larger surfaces. Now with a nice robot smooth finish, I can set this torso head combo aside and start making some little limbs. Normally, the thought of making a minimum of 2 full sets of limbs would make my balls itch in ways I can hardly describe, but the true beauty of Repo Bots is that their arms are tapered tubes and their legs are slightly larger tapered tubes, so making a whole bunch of them takes roughly 15 minutes. In fact, by far the longest part of the eliminating was sanding each of the limbs smooth without taking too much skin off my fingers in the process. Now with my arms and legs sorted, I can get to work adding some detail to the torso. Traditionally, a Repo torso is a pretty bare bones affair, but I'm captain of this ship and I can do what I want, and what I want is to add some extra detail to my Robo torsos by way of shoulder joints and leg joints and extra panels and lots of these itty bitty nuts and bolts that I have left over from my last video. I'll stick these into the corners of each of my extra panels, and anywhere I think they're looking lovely, then it's on to adding eye sockets to the head, which I'll do by marking out the spacing beforehand so I can safely drill some equidistant holes with a terrifyingly large drill bit. These eye sockets get filled with little eyeballs of clay into which I can poke some little robo pupils. To attach the head to the torso in a traditional Canadian style, I'll drill some teeny tiny holes in the top of the torso, then line them up with teeny tiny holes in the underside of the head so I can fit some armature wire in and bend it back, thereby achieving an open-mouthed but still plenty secure screaming robot design. Finally, before I fit the limbs in place, I'll add some little holes into the legs so I can add some supporting armature wire, then I can start adding each of the limbs onto the torso in the appropriate torso sockets. A last little bit of armature wire into the exposed bottom foot of my running robot, and I can add it to the other running robot before setting them both aside so I can make some post-explosion robot bits. I figured there's no conceivable scenario where all 3 robots have successfully evaded the Headman, so rather than have all 3 hail and whole Repo Bots, I'm gonna make the last one in a few pieces. I've baked a sheet of clay around a clay cookie cutter so I can slide it off and break it into even smaller bits. I can then take these broken robot bits and bring them over to the still intact remaining head I have and drill a hole in the empty eye socket so I can stick some wire into it and mount the leftover eyeball on the tip to make it look like it's firing off mid-explosion. I'll then do the same thing to the rest of the bits, drilling holes and mounting them with wires so I can build an explosion later. Otherwise, with 2.5 robots built, it's time to prime these bad boys white so I can start layering on the color. I'll start with the red robot first, mounting it in the block and blasting it with a full all-over dark red base coat. And to add a little excitement to my life, I'll layer over a little lighter red to create a little gradient, then repeat this with the dark blue on the blue robot, followed by a lighter blue blasted from on high, and a yellow-orangey base coat for the remaining robot bits, followed by the necessary lighter yellow highlights. I'll then sponge some basic steel metallics over the top to create plenty of wear and tear, as these robots don't have a particularly long or healthy lifespan, before painting the bolts with a brighter silver to help them stand out a tiny bit more. I'll then follow this with some grimy, greasy, dirt-colored drops leaking out of the various connection points, wiping it away to create the appearance of staining before painting the eyes bright white and the pupils pitch black. Behind the head lies what I assume is the battery indicator, which I'll start with a white base coat followed by a thick coat of fluorescent green. Then it's on to making an explosion out of my remaining robot bits, which means I need a ball of aluminium foil. This little foil ball will be the explosion body that I can jam the various robot bits into at varying lengths, so it looks like this little yellow bot is mid-eruption. And to light my explosion up, I'm going to use this coil of bright red spaghetti lighting that I haphazardly strung together. I'll wrap it around the body of the foil ball and up some of the exploding bits before mounting the whole thing on a wire and adding some explosive clouds by way of hot glue and copious amounts of cotton ball. Finally, to make it look a little less cloudy and a little more explodey, I'll gently blast the tips of the cloud with black through the airbrush, and that's my explosive Repo Bot fully built, which means it's time to make a monster. And not just any monster, but a great big disembodied floating head with glowing yellow eyes. Admittedly, on paper, this isn't the most exciting of monsters, but there's something about being chased down a hall by a big, nearly bald, disembodied head that makes the lizard part of my brain freak out. I'll make the Headman by wrapping a big ball of aluminium foil in some pale pink flesh-colored clay, bulking out the bottom before making some big eye divots and carving out a mouth. I can then thicken up the back of the head since it's a bit too flat and needs to be just slightly too large. Since the beauty of the Headman lies in its not quite correct proportions, then I can start to add the various skin folds and wrinkles around the eyes and cheeks. I'll add a big nose in the middle, blending that into the surrounding eye sockets before exaggerating the lips and wrinkles until they're extra unsettling. The Headman needs some breathing holes, so I'll poke those into his nose, then after some final smoothing and blending to remove the tooling marks, I'll take a soft bristled nylon brush and poke the entire surface to give the skin a nice pory looking texture. I'll use a slightly stiffer brush to add the lip lines to the lips, then I'll set the head to the side while I get to work making some hearing hoops. These start as a little ball that gets smooshed into a fleshy coin and cut in half to create two equally sized semicircles that can get pressed onto the side of the head and poked and prodded until they look almost like proper ears. With the ears added, I'll bake it all to lock it in place, and I can get on to adding all the red bits, which I'll do by pressing some bright clay into the eye sockets and coating the inside of the mouth before coming back to the eyes and creating some swirly wrinkles and folds spiraling from the center outwards. I'll then poke some big divots into the center of the red goo so I can fit some little white balls into those centers before cracking out my box of leftover teeth, which I'll dig through to find a set of lovely little chompers I can fit into the Headman's head. Otherwise, once he's got a big beautiful smile, it's into the oven one final time so I can give him some color. Now the Headman has a nice pale yellow complexion, which I can achieve by glazing his already pale fleshy appearance with a healthy coat of thinned out jaundice yellow, before highlighting the wrinkles and recesses with a darker brown. I'll then add some liver spots and discoloration by flicking some more of that brown onto the surface and dabbing away the excess. The red bits of the eyes and the mouth get a heavy wash with a reddish brown to darken the recesses and add some shading, then I'll pretty up the lips with a little red, wiping it away before it's dried to leave a little bit of the staining behind. I'll clean up the overpainting in the eyes with some isopropyl alcohol, then I can base coat them in a watery orange, followed by a couple dots of progressively lighter yellows to create a nice jaundicey gradient before poking some teeny tiny black dots into the center. Finally, to finish those eyes off, I'll coat each of them in a thick layer of UV resin and paint the inside of the mouth and the rest of the red bits with some high gloss varnish. Then it's time to give this guy some hair plugs. I'll poke some holes into the back of his head so I have something to press these unwound strips of cotton string that I stained with gray ink into. Finally, to give them a bit of support and so that they're flowing backwards as he's flying forwards, I'll dribble some thin CA glue down the hairs so they hang out the back, which will harden them enough that they should stand mostly upright on their own. Otherwise, with that, the Headman is done, which means I need to make a hallway for these guys to run down. I'm going to need some support for my head to hang off of, so I'll build the frame of the hallway out of these sheets of MDF. That'll add some thicker sheets of XPS foam so I have something I can carve into. I also figured a blank back wall is a bit boring, so I cut a door frame out of the back wall so I can add a door to break up the monotony of the bricks. Once I cut the excess off, I can detail the back door by adding some trim to the edge of the door and a strip down the middle so my one door becomes two, filling in the gaps with some gap filler, and I can add a little molding along the base of the wall before flipping the hallway onto its back and turning it upside down so I can slowly and not so methodically carve lots of little bricks into the foam. Normally I'd mark these out so that all my bricks are equally sized and spaced, but I figured in the world of repo, most of these mansions are poorly constructed, so some wonky brickwork is probably lore accurate. Once I've got my bricks blocked out, I'll chop away at a few of them to create some damage and cracking, then I'll mark out the overlarge and slightly wonky floor tiles, cracking and chipping away at them too, before breaking out my rocks to give the surface some nice rocky surface texture. To keep the brick walls looking brick wall-y, instead of rocks, I'll do the same thing with some rolled up foil rolled over the surface. Finally, to protect and prime the foam, I'll coat the whole thing in a mix of wood glue and black paint. Once that's had a chance to properly dry, I'll coat the floor and wall in a light gray base, mixing in some lighter grays and whites haphazardly to create a semi-random, multi-toned base coat. After that's dried, I'll brush a heavy brownish blackish wash over the floor, dabbing away the excess, then do the same thing for the walls, but I'll leave most of the wash in place since I want the highlight to stay in the darker recesses between the bricks. I'll follow all this up by a dry brushing of progressively lighter grays and near whites over the surface to pick up all the sharp edges and rock-added detailing. Then I'll paint the door with a dark brown, wet blending in lighter browns to create a somewhat natural-looking woody blend, making sure to pull the bristles down to add at least a bit of grainy texturing. Finally, to age and weather the walls and floor, I'll add some super watery green and greenish brown streaks and puddles and pools, as well as a light mix of watery pigment powders until everything is extra messy and ugly. With the base built up and weathered appropriately, I can start to attach the various characters into their appropriate places, starting with the Headman who needs to be flying, so I drilled a hole through the wall and out the back of the board so I can fit this thick acrylic rod I bent at 90 degrees, holding it in place with a copious blob of hot glue and plenty of aluminium tape. I can then fit the Headman onto the rod, jamming it into his ear to support his girthy noggin. Then I'll fit the exploding yellow bots supporting rod through a smaller hole I added earlier, feeding the wire out the back and holding it all in place with more glue and tape. I'll then connect the exposed wire to a 9-volt battery pack, and I can glue the pack onto the back of the board with just enough glue to hold it in place, but not so much that I can't take it off and repurpose it in another video. Otherwise, a quick repositioning of the explosion and I can add my last 2 bots running away in abject terror, and well, that's us all done here and onto the Glamour Shots. As always, a big old thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon, and a special hey how are you to the newest of them, Dean Kalitri, Non, happy birthday cat, I love you so much, sincerely Gib and our kitties, Micro and Nano, Connor Putland, Monty343, Amarosa, Amoeba Milkshake, Destry Robbins, Egg Noggin, Luminous, Trickyville, Peppercat, Honor and Olivia, Aaron Sticklin, By Mammy Cute, Teddy, Stolid Purple, Otsana, Sam Fabulous, Badabadum, D-Dub, It's Aluminum Adam, god dang it, and I love your chan. Hiya folks, my name is Adam and I am forced to make tiny nerdy things against my will, please send help. And I joined Patreon just to make north of the border say lettuce. You are the multicolored little bots that provide limitless amounts of freshly repossessed furniture that keep this channel going. Oof, 3 weeks since the last video. Thanks for coming back, unless you didn't come back, then where are you listening to this? Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.